All right, let me go ahead and get started. Again, the link to the live captioning is in the chat box, and we're being recorded. So I want to welcome everybody to the 2020 Virtual Government UX Summit. If anyone was at the previous session, we kicked it off with a great 4 presentations, and I'm looking forward to the rest that are coming today, tomorrow, and Thursday. I want to thank everybody who's helped make this possible, starting with my co-chair, Wendy Stengel, and also the staff at GSA who provided logistical support. I want to thank everybody who submitted proposals and also the team who helped review them and to plan our program. It was not an easy job because we had a lot of great proposals. I want to especially thank all the presenters who took the time to put their presentations together and to share their experiences with us, and to the chairs who are helping to facilitate each of the sessions. And finally, thank you to everybody who's attending today. We wouldn't be here without you, and I'm so excited to see so much interest in our talks this week. We've got 2 sessions a day. We've got 2 more tomorrow and 2 more on Thursday. Please, if you haven't already registered, you'll have to register for each of the sessions independently, and that information will be in the chat. The summit has been organized by Digitalgov and the User Experience Community of Practice. The mission of Digitalgov is to transform how government learns, builds, delivers, and measures digital services in the 21st century. They do that by providing people in the federal government with the tools, methods, practices, and policy guidance they need to deliver effective and accessible digital services. Now, part of their mission is to support the user experience community of practice. Our community provides resources to help those doing user experience work at all levels of the US government, and is open to anyone with an interest in UX and a US government email address. There'll be information about joining in the chat. They'll also have a link to our website, and you can see there Digitalgov supports other communities as well, many of which will be of interest to folks in the doing UX work. So a couple of logistics before we get started. The videos will be available probably a couple weeks after the summit, so in a couple of weeks. The presentations themselves, we're not sure exactly. We're working on that. That may be about the same time frame, but we'll be sure to let everybody know. At the end of the event, you'll see a link to a survey. Please take the time to fill it out so we can make our future events even better. And keep your eye on the chat because there'll be some Digitalgov will be posting helpful links, including the link to the live captioning. If you have any technological issues, please post them in chat. Everybody is muted except for the panelists, so that will be how you'll be able to communicate with us. Also, Beth is our chair today, and she'll be monitoring the chat for questions for the presenters at the end of the session. So please put all your questions and all your issues in chat, and we will follow up on them. And just a final reminder that this event is being recorded. So again, thank you to everybody involved, and I'm going to turn it over to Beth Martin, who's chairing the session.
Hi, I'm Beth Martin. I'm UX lead with the FAA. Our speakers today are Jennifer Strickland and Kendra Skene. They will be talking to you this afternoon about designing and developing accessible digital products. Their presentation is called Ohana for Digital Service Design. Jennifer is a contractor supporting VA.gov, where she serves as an accessibility subject matter expert for teams modernizing applications and services. With more than 25 years of experience across the digital product landscape, Jennifer has led numerous product teams and delivered outstanding results by always prioritizing accessibility, inclusive design, and web performance. Kendra is also a contractor supporting VA.gov, where she serves as the product lead for the agency's growing API platform. She has more than 10 years of government digital product experience, and she has led and championed accessibility initiatives for both state and federal programs. So I will turn it over to Jennifer and Kendra.
Hello, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? If you can't, of course, I'll watch the chat. So we're here today to talk about how we're going to incorporate Ohana throughout your digital product lifecycle. So Ohana originated with me because I'm a bit squishy. If you've ever met me, you know I tend to be a little, it goes with the curls, the arty background. I saw it in the movie Lilo and Stitch and was moved by how they made sure to keep everyone included. No one gets left behind or forgotten. And in my work at va.gov, that was my driving force, because we really need to make sure at the VA that no one gets left behind or forgotten, after, especially after all our veterans have done for us. And we are all disabled. Situationally, temporarily, or permanently. I know saying off the bat that we are all disabled may sound pretty hot. But if you think about the times when you maybe have had children and you're not getting enough sleep, or you've got one in your arm while you're trying to do all the other things, or if you've had one of those really long weeks and you're not getting as much sleep, or you're trying to multitask, or you've sprained your arm, there are a lot of different ways in which we might be situationally, temporarily disabled, as well as the permanently disabled scenarios that we think of more regularly. Next slide. Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit is something that I highly recommend taking a look at if you're interested in this subject. I think they've done a beautiful job, and I particularly love their illustrations going through the various situations of permanent, temporary, or situational impairments.
I think this one in particular is really important as a level set, because when we talk about accessibility, I think a lot of us default to screen readers, you know, for people that have visual disabilities, but we know that there's a wide range of reasons why somebody might need some sort of accessible thought that goes into their digital properties.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I know folks that work at, I've spoken with contractors who worked at, say, NASA, and they say, we don't need to worry about accessibility at NASA. Well, what if somebody breaks their arm and they have a temporary disability? And being able to navigate by just the keyboard instead of also the mouse is going to make a big difference in their productivity.
Very true.
So I had a client that in a presentation say recently that we're bringing Fortune 500 quality to government services. And it struck me. And I said, no, that's not quite what we're doing, because we're working in the federal space. So we differ working in the government because of, da-da, it's coming, Section 508. And this is usually the response people get when they think about what having to worry about Section 508. So this talk is going to help explain a little more about what is Section 508 and what is inclusive design. So this graphic builds on it. So Section 508 is built on something called WCAG 2.0. WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And in WCAG 2.0, there's success criteria for blindness, deafness, and keyboard usage. WCAG 2.0 came out a while ago, but was only adopted relatively recently by Section 508. Since right after it was adopted, WCAG 2.1 came out, and that adds mobile and cognition success criteria, which means that more people are able to use it. It also improves comprehension for everybody through the use of plain language success criteria and other things. Then the next level would be inclusive design. That means it's accessible for all, not just people with disabilities. Think about people who maybe have old devices or on challenging connectivity scenarios. That pesky slow 3G that we often forget about in our product lifecycle process. And then overall is usability, the overall ease of use, that makes it easy for everybody to use, and it means that it's accessible, usable, and all of those business goals that you worry about, you're more likely to attain them the more usable your product is. And now,
so for compliance, a lot of times we're thinking about this bottom section, Section 508, are the things, the boxes that we have to check. But when we're thinking about our goal is to serve all of the people that are coming to these government websites, we really need to be thinking through this whole range of ways that people might be interacting, and how do we make sure that everyone gets the best experience they can.
Click. There you go. So this is something I wanted to highlight a little bit more. Because WCAG 2.0 came out in 2008, but wasn't adopted to Section 508 until 2017, but then 2.1 came out in 2018, then they're already working on WCAG 3.0, which is referred to as Silver. And on a call recently, a Digitalgov call, the Access Board indicated that they anticipate waiting until that comes out to update Section 508 again. For us at the VA, this isn't quite enough. We really need to make sure that we're thinking about WCAG 2.1, because at least half of our veteran population have an identified cognitive impairment, PTSD or traumatic brain injury, anxiety, depression, etc. And we really need to be pushing beyond just Section 508 compliance to doing what we call accessibility beyond compliance. And the Access Board gives a recommendation for how you might meet Section 508 if you're not sure how to get started. There's a link that'll be on the slides, plus you can also find it on section508.gov. But the first part is help just build awareness. At the VA, I've done a lot of talking about how we do accessibility and inclusive design earlier, because a lot of folks think that accessibility is development's responsibility and it's something you do at the end. And as we'll discuss more, there are tremendous advantages to doing it earlier. Then practice inclusive design. I was told when I started that inclusive design was activism and that I should not be doing that at work. But I come from the Jeffrey Zeldman School, the Designing with Web Standards, where doing accessibility is part of doing your job well. It's simply professionalism. And we all in our various disciplines have a lot on our plates. The different fields just keep getting more complicated. So that's one of those things that sort of has slipped off. Then how do we update the agency policies? How do we update the training? How do we communicate that in our product requirements from the beginning? Making sure that all of our documentation is accessible, and then measure and monitor. One of the things about Section 508 that's often overlooked is anything that is purchased with federal monies must be accessible. So that means the videos that you may record during your just going about doing your job, the emails, slide decks, all of that must be accessible. So we have a few case studies here, and first off, Kendra's going to start about her work on Georgia.gov.
All right. So before I moved to working on federal work, I spent about 10 years working for the state of Georgia on Georgia.gov and our web platform that served over 80 state agency websites. And when we built out that platform, we made sure to check the box, right? We were meeting Section 508 standards. But at that time, that actually wasn't even, that was the old Section 508. That's before we got to WCAG 2.0 standards. And as we were talking to people through our work, we learned that, you know, what we had wasn't quite meeting the bar, that we weren't as accessible as we could be, that yes, we checked some boxes, but that didn't mean it was really easy for people using screen readers or other devices to navigate our sites. And so we decided that we wanted to go through and do a holistic accessibility initiative to improve all of our sites to WCAG 2.0 standards. Now, something that I think is important to bring up here now, because we're all people working in government where we know we have to fight these good fights and sometimes it can be hard, is that when my team first decided that we wanted to do this, my boss, our director, mentioned it to his boss, who is, in the C-level leadership for the agency. And he actually laughed in our faces. I mean, bust out laughing. So funny. We wanted to do all this accessibility work and then just said, no, there's no budget for that. And this is where I would have and did say, well, shoot, that's frustrating. What do we do now? My boss taught me a lot, smarter than me about this. And he said, well, we're just going to find the money somewhere else. We're going to do it anyways because it's the right thing to do. And so we did it anyways. We found the money, we made it happen. And then we started getting recognized for it from different, like state CIO board things. And then the guy that laughed at us was first in line for his photo op to take the credit for the work that we did. Lesson learned for me is do the right thing every time, and other people will come around, right? And take the credit. It's fine. I'm letting you know now, right? But
nice
so
comment.
That's right. What we did is did holistic audit across the platform because we had one platform on multiple sites that supported multiple sites. We were able to remediate templates and backend code, and then that would flow through to all 80 sites at once. And that really helped check our boxes for improving design and development of all of the sites. But then we had to go talk to all of our teams, make sure that we leveled up all of the agencies that were maintaining content and flag for them the things that they could do to improve their content to make that more accessible also. And then the big thing beyond all of that was train our team, right? None of us knew what any of this was when we started. We didn't have to become experts to be able to do this. We were able to call in some experts to work with us. We learned through the process. And once we learned, we're like, well, shoot, we should always be doing this from the beginning. This is a lot of extra work to do it at the end. So how can we scale accessibility best practices throughout not only our framework and design systems, but throughout our process? So we made sure, how's all of our team at least get those basics of what needs to happen, and let's train all of our content managers so that the next time we're starting from the beginning. The last thing that we did is, because we could do this, we updated Georgia's standards to require WCAG 2.0 before Section 508 required WCAG 2.0. And so that's another thing that I'd like to call out is for places where you have that additional clout to make change at a level for your agency that isn't matching up with, where the access board's going to take a little while to level up. It doesn't stop us from doing the right thing and making sure that we're hitting all the standards, making things as universally inclusive as possible.
So the FEMA Flood Smart is one of my case studies, and it was my first foray into actually getting to do federal work. And I admired the USWDS, 18F, USDS for years, and I've applied so many times, but I haven't quite made it, but it's okay. I'm doing something now. And with FEMA Flood Smart, I was working with a small ad agency in town, and they had this project and they didn't know how to do UX. They didn't know how to do responsive. They didn't know how to do human-centered design, and they definitely didn't know how they were going to do that with a prime contractor and a Drupal 8 requirement. I came in and was able to evaluate things. One of the weird things about this particular project, to my mind, but maybe for anyone who's worked in government longer, is there was a task order that said we couldn't talk to users until like 6 or 8 down the pipeline, but the overall project was user-centered redesign, user-centered responsive redesign using Drupal 8. So I said, we've been told to do this in a user-centered fashion, and that means we figure out how we involve users. So starting with research that we found a creative way to do using our networks and all of that stuff to do optimal workshops, tree studies, and card sorts, and ask people, what are these, where would you put these? What do you call this? And then built our taxonomy off of that. Use plain language, their own words, and then storytelling to foster the cognitive empathy. When we started the project, our stakeholders thought they were getting a marketing site. They thought that it was going to be like big splashy photos and movement and all of this. And I told the story of an oil rig worker in the Gulf who has a house in Houma, Louisiana, and he's worked a really long shift. He's got his little cell phone and he's tired, and he just needs to make sure that he really has the right flood insurance for his property because they're heading into hurricane season. That was the change. And now Butch Kearney is a champion for inclusive design, and he tells that story. And when the page, some of the interior, this is the landing page, some of the interior pages, as they said, they look a little bland, but they're performant, and their hierarchy is clear, and you can get to the info. And so he wound up being one of our champions. And I suppose one of the things that I haven't listed here, or actually anywhere in the slide, I don't know why I didn't, but find your champions, train your champions, not just your team, but make sure that you get your stakeholders to be on your side all the time. So another unique thing done here is that from the wireframes all the way through, we used HTML, CSS, JavaScript wireframes because I happen to be a designer who codes. I used the USWDS system, the V1, the version 1 that they had, where you could easily copy and paste and just repurpose it. And I pair programmed with their designer, who was a very talented visual designer, but didn't know how to do responsive or work with CMS templates. And we designed this together, and we figured out things like dropping out the image when you get down to smaller devices and replacing it with just a very lightweight SVG texture. Different things like that. And then moving into the test-driven design and development, because the prototypes are in HTML and CSS, we can use various tooling to measure the impact of design decisions and then communicate those metrics to development as these are requirements. Page load speed, time to interactive must be no greater than 2 seconds. All images must be no greater than 50 kilobytes, et cetera, et cetera. The more data you can give them to put into their acceptance criteria, that gives you something to meet. Next slide. And then speaking about performance, I also worked on a performance analytics tool proof of concept for this large CDN company. And I was part of an independent team that was determined to deliver a world-class example for our customers to follow. The existing infrastructure was a bit on the slow side, and their existing process leveraged Axure and Angular and Bootstrap, all things that were going to render a slower turnaround time. So once again, leveraging the HTML, CSS, JavaScript prototypes. And the wonderful thing about this product owner is he was on board from the beginning. And we put WCAG 2.0 AA and where possible AAA as product requirements. We put product requirements to speak to people with disabilities in our research and make sure that everything we did was going to be not only responsive, not only performant, but accessible at every point. And we, once again, were able to leverage test-driven design and development. And this was the kicker that I wish that I could highlight on more teams, is because we did it this way, we could get turnaround time on design prototypes. We improved the time it took by 95% compared to what would happen with the Axure and Angular, et cetera, process. And so we were able to get in more iterations.
It's a remarkable reduction. It's amazing.
We did something similar previous to that, or I did something similar at another financial investment company where they had desktop only interfaces for all of their retail financial tools. And this was about 2012, 2013. And they've been stuck for a year on how do we responsify this? How are we going to make the positions grid specifically, which is a data grid of a minimum of 13 columns and anywhere from 1 to thousands of rows of financial data that could be for people who don't have very much money all the way up to people who have a ton. So little figures tell really large figures inside each of these columns. And they've been leveraging a lot of JavaScript to try to calculate things on the fly. And every time they got down to the mobile size, the screen would freeze. The layout would break because it was just too bloated. On day 2, I crafted this HTML, CSS quick sketch of how it might work with just using CSS. And it took months because the team was already dedicated to using JavaScript. But 3 months later, the VP said, "I'm not happy with this. What else have you got?" And he chose this solution. So 3 months later, we launched. And by helping the VP understand what it was that the users, by going into the usability lab with users and pivoting based on the information they gave us. We were very lucky because this particular organization, one of my beloved mentors who just passed away from COVID, Tom Tullis, built this magical usability lab that allowed us to bring users in and sometimes also use technology to meet them where they are and make sure everything that we do is co-created with them. And one of the things that the director of this project did was in hiring me was having a prototyper that I worked across the project from in IA through design, through this prototyping as well as with the developers, and being able to incorporate realistic data and incorporate customer feedback immediately based in our usability sessions. It's so lovely to see other people appreciate him. I'm so grateful for him. And being able to monitor the incremental changes we make and the impact on the UX. So I bet you all want to get started. So the takeaways from our case studies. Accessibility is a business requirement. Measure, monitor key metrics. Co-create with your audience. Cultivate cognitive empathy across not just your team, but your stakeholders to make sure they're your champions too. Industry best practices all the way through, and cultivate an accessibility and inclusive design culture.
All right, so talking a little bit more about prioritizing accessibility as part of the process, looks at where in every checkpoint can we, include accessibility? Can we make sure that along with thinking about the other boxes we're trying to check that we're including this? So I'm going to say this every time I talk, train your team. Education and awareness are key. And then when you're auditing things with an expert, ask lots of questions, right? Like we need to just keep in mind it's okay not to know already all of the things we're not supposed to know already, but we can ask questions and try to figure out how to get to there, and that's part of our learning process too. And then establishing definitions of done for stages of work, including accessibility audits. So this is my little explanation of how you go from accessibility when you don't have accessibility in the process and when you do. So if we start out without accessibility baked in when we're not thinking about it, procurements, takes no effort to think about accessibility because we just didn't even do it. And so same with discovery. If we're digging into what are the problems we're solving and accessibility is not included, takes no effort. But as we get into design, and when I say cost, that's the time, effort, or capital, right, that are required to remediate accessibility issues. If you start thinking of it when you get to design, you're going to be putting in some, right, but we're still not thinking a lot about it. So we might hit a few checkpoints and we're not really digging in to make sure we have it right. And so that means that when we get to development, we're going to be putting in more effort to try to fix things as we go. But testing is where usually is where we start to introduce this. We start testing, we say, oh no, here's this long list of things that we need to remediate, and then that throws off our timelines, right? So now you're playing this game of, well, do we put off launch so that we can go back and fix these things, or do we launch with the things broken and know that then we have to figure out going back to prioritize them? And will we prioritize them? How much more is that going to cost? What else is that going to throw off, right? And so when we get to deployment without thinking about accessibility, it's going to be a bad day. We've forgotten this key thing that we know legally we have to do. We know that it really impacts whether or not the people that need our services the most and government services are getting those services. And because we haven't thought about it, now we're trying to figure out how do we, back up and get some things fixed.
And this what you've drawn as the initial, you'd think that we're doing this to exaggerate, but I can't tell you how many times this is exactly what I've walked into. And it takes a lot to get it to something else.
Yeah, this is the norm, right? This is why it took a year for us to remediate all of the accessibility issues on a platform that hadn't started there. So what lessons learned is we want to start with accessibility checkpoints from the beginning. So checkpoints in training. So in procurements, you can write requirements not only that that vendors do things that meet WCAG 2.0 standards, that they have audits. You can also bring in third-party auditors. But another thing that I've done in the past is ask for vendors to demonstrate where they've included accessibility in their previous work and how it's part of their process. So that way you're making sure that you've got people that, that know what this is and at least have thought about how they're going to bake this into their process. And so you're also going to then spend some extra effort and time when you're doing discovery. If you're including different use cases and stress cases for the people that you're talking to, when you're testing across and looking at call logs and different things to make sure that you're understanding all of the problems during your discovery piece of this work. Design, if you're actually thinking about the accessibility here, it's going to be a little more effort than when you're not, but at this point, you're already thinking about what your color palettes are going to be and making sure your color contrast is right. And so it's not going to be a huge additional lift to include this within your design process. And so what that means is that at development, there's less time going back to say, well, what does this need to do? How are we getting these things right? And so remediating or even just making sure that you're checking all the boxes here at the development stage. If it's part of your process, not only does it become something that your teams do, and so they do it by default, every time they build new things, they already know this next thing that they learned last time around, so each time development's going to be quicker. What that means is that once you get to your accessibility auditors and we do that final round of testing, you're going to find so few, what's the right word here? A lot fewer issues. Fewer accessibility issues, which, I mean, first of all, you don't have developers and designers that are stressed out because they have to go back and fix something, that wasn't built into your timelines. But you're also, there's less things to deal with. And so everyone's feeling good about their work. We're fixing a few things because there's always going to be a few things, but it gets us all the way down to a party at deployment. Instead of the stress, we all get to celebrate, it's good, it's done, ship it, and what's the next thing we're going to do? And so this is why we advocate for, let's bake it in, let's get it through the whole process instead of, something that we check at the end. So defining, measuring, and monitoring key metrics is one piece for that. We can make sure that we have accessibility checkpoints along the way and performance budgets as a business requirement from the start, and stick to those performance budgets, right? Like, how long does this page take to load? I know we want that flashy, fancy, a little bit of but something that we put in here, but is that actually adding value, and is that hurting our performance for
One of
getting?
the things I see teams spend a lot of time on is web fonts. And web fonts are one of the things that are going to block your rendering time and really, really do a number on your performance. And using web page tests to watch the impact and see that it takes 30 seconds for something to load just because you've got all the fonts helps tell that story.
Yeah, we've used web page test a lot in the past too. That is a really helpful way to see just how painful this can be for someone that's not on a quick internet connection. And then we can check call center volume as a metric. If call center volumes are going down, that should, and services are not going down, right? That should show us that what we're doing on our websites is more accessible and easier to access, easier to complete the work. Time on site, depending on what the work is, I've actually looked for time on site to decrease instead of increase, because we're not Facebook, we're not selling ads, and our goal is not to get more time on our site. Our goal is to let people get what they need and then move on with their day. So they shouldn't be struggling through it, which means, you know, we should be able to accomplish things and it take less time. And then again, looking at performance metrics and being able to show how much we're meeting accessibility compliance needs along the way too.
Compliance is something often, so a lot of us are working for federal agencies, and Congress funds a lot of the work that we do. Congress can't necessarily, they're not UX experts, they don't know much about product design, but they're going to look at numbers to tell whether or not they're getting the money, the benefit for the money. And accessibility compliance and the reports that the 508 office sends to Congress are going to make them decide whether or not you're delivering on the expectations. And basically, we just want to make sure everyone can get access to their information and their benefits. Involving your users and involving a diverse version of your users is super important. Every stage of decision making, early, often, real people, and make sure you figure out when and if you can involve people with disabilities. Figure out if your process maybe even needs to be reevaluated in order to involve people with disabilities. I recognize a lot of designers use Envision or a comparable tool, and that prevents including people with disabilities. But if you use UX Pin, you can include a few more people with disabilities. And if you do something I recommend, which is hiring a prototyper in between design and development, or strategically use it for just select projects, you can include people with disabilities. You can test with people who are using assistive technology. And conduct user research, not just usability testing, but listening sessions to just listen, hear how people are currently solving the problems, what their purpose is. Use their language, and figure out how you can take those stories to foster cognitive empathy. One of the first things I did working on VA.gov was talk to a caregiver who's now in Fort Lauderdale, and the details she told me are what drive me every day, because I know how hard she and her husband and family work, and the stories she told me about her friends, and that who are also veterans and caregivers, and being able to transfer those stories onto my teams and our product owners, it really helps.
I think another piece that I hear a lot is this assumption that, okay, but people that can't access my site because it's not accessible to them, they'll just get somebody else to help them. But that's not always possible. It robs people of dignity, right? Because now they have to ask for help, and not everyone can ask for help all the time. I think more than anything, it means that it starts loading up our call centers and people still aren't getting the help that they need.
It also puts that individual at risk, because now they may have to share their personal data, their login credentials, and have another person see their personal data that they may not want to share, and that, that person that they're asking for help may have nefarious purposes.
That's a really good point.
Like cognitive empathy, cognitive empathy, cognitive empathy, care, care, care. I feel like I can't beat that horse enough. Making sure that you figure out how to find champions that's the biggest thing, I think. As an accessibility specialist working at va.gov, I was originally tasked with a certain set of skills, a certain set of tasks. But in order to be constructive and productive and maybe reduce the amount of work that's happening at the end of the cycle, I have got to figure out how to get accessibility, inclusive design considered at the start. And if my direct boss isn't helping me and their boss isn't helping me, where else do I need to go? And full disclosure, one of those accessibility champions I've already seen this on this call, and I want to say thank you so much. Now we just need to keep spreading it, a positive pandemic of caring.
And train your team. As an aside, by the end of our accessibility initiative in Georgia, the entire C-level, C-suite's all on board, and now they remind everyone else to make things accessible. So I am a firm believer so much of this is not because people don't want to, it's that they don't understand the impact. So
we created an ALLY Champs, an accessibility. So ALLY, A11Y is a short for accessibility sometimes. So we created an ALLY Champs program where we each quarter take a selection of our team members and train them up on how to do accessibility, so that my hope is that at some point I'm a multiplier, and I will hopefully put myself out of a job, and then we can move on to the next one. And so train. Best practices exist for a reason, and if 18F or GSA or hopefully VA have done something that you can follow their lead and reuse something they've worked through, do it. And then we have great thought leaders in the industry that have documented what responsive design means. Ethan Marcotte, Tim Cadillac, accessibility, Laura Kalbag, Sean Henry. You'll see at the end there's a resources link. My brain is going blank, but there's a long list of resources. And if you can't get an accessibility person on your team, find an expert to help identify and prioritize the issues you have. And that's also included in the resources section. The responsive design is one of the things that will help you most with accessibility, with inclusive design. You won't be leaving people out if you're doing so. Adaptive leaves people out in the spaces that you haven't designed and accounted for. Using progressive enhancement ensures that a baseline experience is available to anyone. For example, if the rare person exists that still doesn't use JavaScript, they can still get in. But it's not just that rare person who doesn't use JavaScript, it's that person who is in a remote place and they have a very slow connection. How fast is that data coming to them? If you're using only React to load everything, they're not going to get it for 30 or more seconds. And when we're talking about critical information in some cases, you want to make sure that's available on first load with HTML and not have JavaScript required. And then make sure that you're applying those best practices through all of the frameworks. I mentioned React. Make sure that when you're building the components in React or Angular or whatever you're using, that you've thought about those best practices as you build those components, and you document in your design system. In the design system, when you're documenting how to use things, use human-centered design and inclusive design for that documentation itself. Think about if your 5-year-old niece or nephew wanted to read that design system, are they going to understand it? And I know that's maybe a an out there example, but it really should be that simple. And Steve Krug's words don't make me think. Be pedantic in your documentation, be very, very clear, and be consistent with all of the patterns. If you're, for example, on va.gov, we put a gold focus outline where focus is. And when we break the usual interactive patterns, focus usually only happens on interactive elements, but sometimes we apply focus to text elements. And when focus is on those text elements, we put the gold outline, so you know exactly where focus is.
One thing I want to call out, which can sometimes be a misconception, design systems or accessible frameworks get you there, right? Like they get you a portion of the way, but that doesn't guarantee that everything you do is going to be accessible. So you still want to double check and test things even when you're using a design system.
And design systems are often a work in progress and might not have had the audits as well. So next slide.
And time check, we're at, we hit 45 minutes, so we want to try to follow these.
As I've banged my gong numerous times, semantic HTML, CSS, responsive wireframes, testable design prototypes. So I've said it, hire a prototyper if your designers don't code. Often they're referred to as design technologists. Amazon uses them, Microsoft uses them, Facebook uses them. And to use test-driven design and development, which I think I've explained before. Just make sure that you're always evaluating the impact of various decisions that you make and incorporating diverse people in your validation. Next slide. Prioritizing with semantic HTML. I can't emphasize how important this is, and this is an insider dev joke. Comment your code so that people in the future understand what the intentions were. And this is about applying inclusive design into your development habits, making sure that you all agree ahead of time that you're going to also be doing that in your workflows. When you're testing invalid data, make sure it's super obvious that it's invalid data, that it's test data, and put something in there that couldn't possibly be seen as actual data. And this wonderful Jamie Knight, he's a well-known accessibility thought leader. He says he tends to use Disney villains. So in his, if Scar shows up, that means it's test data. Next slide. We also wanted to give you an idea of what kind of artifacts you might want to create and deliver at various checkpoints in product. And in this product column, some of them may be more business and operations than product, but making sure your vendors demonstrate that their products are accessible and that they have accessibility expertise in their response. Make sure you've got your accessibility metrics from the beginning. Make sure you up front identify your training opportunities and agree up front in what your inclusive design and accessibility processes and tools will be. Discovery, make sure you identify ways in which to be inclusive in your recruiting methods and research recruiting and methods. And I did create an inclusive research guidelines file in the resources. Identify past work that's accessible. Identify whether or not the tools that you're using are accessible. Review the call center logs. I can go through and read all of this, but you'll have this in the slides as we go through. One of the big points is most of our work is held to something called an authority launch, referred to as an ATO. And the ATO says that in order to launch, you must pass a series of end-to-end tests. So those end-to-end tests include something called ACTS checks, which are built on the WCAG success criteria. In order to launch, your deployment must pass those tests first and then be followed up by manual tests. So on va.gov, I'm focusing primarily on cultivating accessibility inclusive design expertise across everyone in the team so that I can be a multiplier and put myself out of a job or move on to the next level of it. focused on strategy. I'm focusing on creating resources so that when people have questions, they have tools and resources that are easily available to them. Setting up the training opportunities like the Alley Champs. And then the storytelling. I created a page in our repo that has veterans disability statistics so that it's not just me saying that there are a lot of veterans who need you to be thinking about accessibility. There are actual numbers and included videos and essays and articles in there so you can read about the actual human beings. And at the end of the day, we're all in this together. I mean, that comes with all of the work that we do as Agile, and that whole idea of if you don't know something, that's okay. Ask. There is no shame in not knowing. Please ask. And you are welcome to find me on LinkedIn and ask. I'll do the best I can. And then the next slide has the resources. So accessibility.digital.gov. I love this thing. I wish I could actually revise it a smidge, but it's a great place to start. Section 508.gov if you really want the facts. And then uxui.org/resources one is a site I maintain. And I admit that I need to do a little bit of work on maybe making the vast amount of data more palatable and easy to digest, but it's at least accessible. Thank you.
Lots of good resources there. Thank you. I'm going to leave this this slide up for people as we take questions, if we have a few minutes per question.
Yeah, we have can you hear me? Okay,
yes.
Great. We have about 10 minutes. I was really interested in the presentation that you made, but can you talk a little bit about how we can make the case for who owns accessible digital products, especially for people who don't do web? So people who provide you content that you have to incorporate as part of your overall accessible design and maintenance?
Yes.
If you have to,
can you tell me a little bit more about like the question of who is it that you're looking to?
Well, this was a question that I was thinking of as you were giving this presentation, and you were talking about training and evangelizing, and so we do certainly want to make certain to advocate and evangelize, but for folks who say, well, that's your responsibility, but we also, in our organizations need to help people to understand that the digital products that they provide to us, like PDFs, for example, need to be accessible. And there's some resistance to that. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, if you've encountered that.
Yeah, definitely have. So for my particular project, we have a range of PDFs, and we have some that are provided by the business at the VA. And we are able to evaluate the PDF quickly using Adobe Acrobat Pro and run a quick scan and determine, is this or is this not accessible? If it's not accessible, we do send it back to them, and then we refer them to the VA 508 office for remediation, to help them with remediating it. If I had more time, if I'm one person supporting 9 that are really 12 teams at present, but if we were staffed a bit, we're working on it, we're getting there. I would happily help them learn how to remediate, but we have training at TMS, which I think is a VA only thing, but I'm not sure. And people are able to take training there to learn how. There's also lynda.com that has training. There are Adobe Acrobat tutorials on how to remediate PDFs. There's also how to make accessible Word documents and PowerPoints and all of those other things. So it depends on the relationship. I've learned that there are some relationships that I know they're going to say, no, that is your job and you do it. And so depending on what kind of support I have, I may just do it for them because I don't want to deal with the headache. But when possible and when I have leadership support, I prefer to send it back rather than giving them the fish, teaching them to fish.
Right.
Yeah, I try to focus on the idea of the carrots and the sticks. So what are the things that will make people want to be part of the solutions that are part of the problem? And sometimes that works, right? Sometimes you can just explain to someone how them remediating this in the beginning means that it's going to go on the website more quickly. You know, they're not going to have to wait for you to find someone that has time to help them remediate or whatever it is. And maybe sometimes once they see how easy it is, that'll work. But to Jen's point, you know, not everybody is going to be won over by a carrot. And so next question is, can you be talking to leadership and selling the business case that everything will move more smoothly if we build this in as part of the process and expect it from everybody?
Okay, great. Christina asks, for Jennifer, how many other people did you work with on your FEMA project? Maybe you
Sure.
could talk about the team that you had.
Sure, we were a sub to a prime, and on the prime there was a project manager, a back-end developer, and a front-end developer who was responsible for implementing in the CMS. And then within the agency I worked at, there was a visual designer, there was a project manager, and there was they call him a UX strategist. I would call what he did more product management. He was more the hostess with the mostest. They had originally wanted him to do the content strategy, and he looked at it and was going to quit because he had no idea how he was going to do that. And I said, don't worry about it, I gotcha. And I did it. He's now at Oracle, and he's awesome, by the way. I learned things from him that I should have learned earlier in my career, which was going into a meeting, always bring flowers, always make people feel welcome, and remember they're human beings. I tend to be too quick to like, we just want to get the work done, right? Lesson learned.
Yeah, yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the Alley Champs program that you mentioned?
Sure. I think the VA Gov repo is public, but I'm never really sure how public that means. We set it up so that we identified people who cared about accessibility already. We identified people who were on project teams that were really going to need somebody to take ownership of it for their team, because we have all of our teams taking on what someone termed low-level accessibility testing. I struggle with that term low level because this isn't running an Axe browser scan is not low-level testing to someone who has no idea what that browser scan report means. It's hard. But teaching them, we started off with building the empathy. We showed a lot of stories about people with disabilities, including invisible disabilities, and getting people bought into why this matters. And then we're slowly, with each level, adding into the skill set, teaching them how to run scans, teaching them how to write issue tickets that are empathetic and take into account that people like Kendra, the product manager, needs to be able to prioritize this issue ticket and understand the human impact of it. We built out a defect rubric and helping people understand what that means, and also always providing the WCAG guidance. So in the Alley Champs program, it's one level at a time up. We had originally scoped it out to 4 levels, and I recently added a 5th in order to help people learn how to do PDFs.
Oh, okay, great. Do you have a web address handy for that, for the program? For the VA Alley program?
It's in the GitHub repo for the va.gov team. I'm not sure. I'm not positive. Kendra, do you know if we're allowed to share that?
If it's public, you can. I'm not sure if it is or not, but we could check. You could add it. We can check and then add it to the uxui.org resources page once we confirm if it's public.
Okay.
I think it's fantastic. We've been asking all our new team members on my program to start out. We're calling it Ramp Up Fridays. So Fridays, they're doing things like going through the Alley Champs curriculum to make sure that we're all leveled up for the work we're doing.
Okay, great. Well, it is 2:30, and I think that covers all of the main questions that we had. So thank you so much for your time. This was really great. And for folks online, Jean, did you want to mention again the registration?
Yep, there should be links in the chat if you want to register for any of the remaining 4 sessions. And also, please give us your feedback on the session today so we can improve our sessions for the future. And thank you to Jennifer and Kendra for their great talk today. I saw a lot of great feedback in the chat. And thank you to Beth for chairing the session today.
Thank you. This was great.
All right.
Ohana, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.